hopefully seem as important to you as the subject does to me. Some of you in the room will remember a time when millions of U.S. citizens took to the streets to protest the Vietnam War, largely in reaction against reports of the cruel and indiscriminate killing of innocent civilians by the U.S. military. They chanted phrases like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Or "Stop the war, stop the killing," or just angrily hurling accusations of murderer and baby killer. And this atrocious disregard for innocent life was so blatant that the nation's military then first began using the phrase collateral damage to officially describe the civilians being killed in its brutal bombing campaigns. During the Gulf War in 1991, the invasion of Afghanistan that followed beginning in 2001, and the Iraq War that started in 2003, almost everyone was using this sanitized phrase, collateral damage. The U.S. military, the news media, and ordinary citizens to refer to hundreds of thousands, more likely millions, of innocent people killed in their aftermaths. As unforgivable as these deaths were, the most euphemized disregard for innocent life was during the Nazi Holocaust, resulting in the deliberate and mechanical murder of millions of Jews, Russians, Poles, homosexuals, and disabled persons. And they referred to these planned exterminations, not as exterminations, but as the final solution. To their mass extinctions as special treatment, to their arbitrary arrest of innocent people as protective custody, and to their removal as cleansing or purification. And to the killing of those with disabilities, they call these mercy killings, or use the scientific term euthanasia, as if they were doing these particular victims a kindness by ending their suffering. The gas chambers and crematoria were called special installations, where they only processed those they had merely deported. Such language allowed Hitler, a vegetarian who could not bring himself to attend a single murder or execution, to avoid confronting himself with the true consequences of his evil heart. Today, Israel is rebuffing anyone who calls their actions against innocent Palestinians, including their murder, forced removal, and starvation, genocide or war crimes. They prefer to blame these results on Hamas, accusing the Islamic militant group of using their own people as human shields. And maybe in some cases they are. Or they point to the cruel and horrific events of the October 7th, 2023 attacks as justification for engaging in the same or even worse behavior themselves. But how would this excuse hold up if the police showed up to a bank robbery and shot all the hostages to get at the bank robbers? Would they then get away with blaming the criminals for their deaths? These are extreme examples of something all of us do. Rationalize our own behavior to justify what we are doing, maybe even especially to ourselves, when we know deep down that what we're doing is wrong. We blame those we victimize. We convince ourselves that what we are doing is for some greater cause, to save Germany, to protect our freedoms, to kill the kidnappers, to get the worst of the worst criminals out of our country, as Donald Trump is now claiming, in order to justify indiscriminately rounding up and removing thousands of innocent immigrants from our communities. But all of us sometimes engage in such behavior, even if only on smaller scales. A couple of years ago, for example, a driver going too fast through an uncontrolled four-way stop totaled my car. As we waited for the police to arrive, the body language of the driver responsible suggested that he was becoming increasingly agitated. He began angrily glaring at me from across the street, which made me think that he was blaming me for the accident. And after a while, with a look of disgust, he looked at me with disgust, I should say, flicked a cigarette to the ground, abruptly jumped into his lightly damaged truck, and sped away. Now, he must have given further thought to the wisdom of fleeing the scene of an accident and eventually returned. Fear, the feeling of being endangered, often turns into anger, which prepares us to defend and protect ourselves. So that this fellow had both of these emotions after a serious car accident is no surprise. Nor is it a surprise that he rationalized his emotions by concocting reasons to blame me, the source of the threat, for the accident. Reasons that he explained to the police officers when they arrived to take his statement. Having no feelings about the accident, however, the officers looked at the simple facts. My vehicle was coming from the right, his from the left, so they cited him for failing to yield the right-of-way, and his insurance company paid for the accident. Yet at least for a period of time, he had managed to convince himself that the accident was my fault, and therefore he felt justified in committing an additional crime by initially fleeing the scene of the accident that in reality he had caused. But even this example is too big. The same dynamics, it's a lot smaller than the Holocaust by all means, but the same dynamics can emerge over the slightest and most insignificant matters sometimes. Like which sports team is best? Don't answer that. Whether a movie is good or not. Don't answer that one either. What colors we should paint the walls, Dean? Hold your tongue. Or where we should place the furniture, or any other matter of mundane importance, right? We have a subjective feeling about the issue, big or small, then we rationalize that feeling, meaning that we translate that feeling into an idea. And then we moralize that idea by not only considering it right, but considering it righteous. Thus, we feel we have a moral obligation to protect it against non-believers, which means anyone who simply disagrees with us, when ultimately we're just protecting a feeling that we had over a particular situation or idea that impacted us. We do this because, as Socrates said, no person knowingly does evil, right? Very few of us really want to be the bad guy in our own story. So we rationalize our true motives to make ourselves seem to be the hero, no matter how wrong or harmful our behavior might be. We are the heroes because we are protecting the world from evildoers, we convince ourselves. Hitler did not consider himself an evil man. He considers himself the great defender of Germany, which he rationalized by demonizing and blaming the Jews, among others, for the nation's woes, and by using euphemistic language to deny what he was really doing. Denied it even to himself. Such repression, unwillingness to face reality, is also why the U.S. government and military, and later the news media and the general public, use the term collateral damage to describe the indiscriminate killing of untold numbers of innocent civilians in the countries that it invaded and occupied. But it didn't use that language. It's why just this week Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described his intention to occupy Gaza City as liberation, as freeing it. We've got to feel we are right. We want to feel we are right, and therefore righteous. Most of us are so inclined to justify our decisions and actions in this way, no matter how big or small, no matter how badly they impact others, that philosophers have long sought the best means of knowing the difference between right and wrong, regardless of how we feel about it or how it impacts our personal interest. How can we go into a situation and not be confused by our emotional state, not be biased by our emotional state or self-interest? This branch of philosophy is called ethics, which comes from the Greek word meaning character. Right? Morality comes from mores, which means laws or rules. But character refers to those qualities about us that are true and reliable no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in. It's different from the persona, the psychological mask that we wear in public just to get along in society. Our character remains present whether we are in public or alone, whether we are seen or not, whether we are acting deliberately or instinctively, whether our circumstances are difficult or easy, whether we are happy, sad, shocked, mad, or afraid. It's our character that guides us to do the right thing when we are in an accident, or when our society is vilifying some group that it has decided to scapegoat, or when a nation is responsible for violence and injustice against innocent people. This is why it is vital, right? Vitality, the root of life, that I believe it is essential to our lives, to our growth, to our full unfolding as individuals, that we intentionally learn about and develop ethics. Because ethics means character, and having character is part of what it means to fully unfold. Developing ethics also means that we are far less likely to make moral decisions on the fly that are based on our feelings and self-interest, most likely unconsciously based on our feelings and self-interest. Instead of making random emotional decisions, those decisions are based on our character, those qualities about us that remain true and reliable no matter what situation we are in. But how can we have character if we've not studied ethics, if we've not developed an ethic? We don't understand what we should do. This requires more than adhering to what we have been taught or told are the differences between right and wrong by our families, our peers, communities, religions, and so forth. Whether some of these may be correct or not, they are derived from our social conditioning, not by taking personal responsibility to learn about and choose for ourselves which ethical approach is best, based on our best educated guess. To help with this, I'm going to broadly outline three main ethical systems. Then I'm going to conclude by sharing a little bit about my ethical journey and why I think it's best. These include rule-based ethics, deontological ethics, outcome-based ethics, also called teleological ethics, and value ethics. So rule-based, outcome-based, and value ethics. Deontological ethics, rule-based, comes from the Greek word for is, or ontos, bases ethical behavior on predetermined rules, laws, mores, and the like, that are believed to be right in all situations, no matter the consequences. Right? Never tell a lie is a rule. Theological voluntarism, the belief that we must always follow God's commands or the teachings of the Bible or of our church, no matter what, is another good example. So, deontological ethics or rule-based ethics ask us to consider, or concentrates on the question, what is the right thing to do? Right, rule-based is, what is the right thing to do? Teleological ethics, from the Greek word end for telos, outcome-based ethics, bases ethical behavior on the results, not on what we do, but what we achieve, like achieving the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, for example, even if it means breaking the rules. Right? This is the thinking and justification for engaging in civil disobedience, for example, because sometimes the rules are harmful and we need to resist them. Outcome-based ethics then ask not what the right thing to do is, but what is the best thing to do. It's a little more nuanced. And these are two very different questions, which shows a little bit about where we're coming at these questions ethically, if we're concentrating on the right thing versus the best thing, or the best thing versus the right thing. Right? The right thing is rather final. The best thing is rather relative. That makes sense. So I consider value-based ethics to be a hybrid of these two opposites. It focuses on certain overarching principles like justice, equality, charity, compassion, and so forth, without being overly directive, right? Without actually telling us how we're supposed to behave. But it creates ethical boundaries around our actions. And it's also bound by more than just the end results of our behavior, right? It also allows us to remain free to choose the best way of adhering to those values. Kant's categorical imperative, for example, that no person should be treated as a means to somebody else's ends, but should be considered an end within themselves, is a good example of a broad value that is non-directive. Right? I'm not telling you what that means exactly, how you adhere to this principle. You figure that out. So in keeping with what we know about moral development, we all start off as deontologists, right, as rule-based thinkers, feeling that right and wrong are determined by following or breaking the rules taught to us by an external authority that knows better than us. That's how we start off in our development. This is accompanied by a punitive mindset, the idea that rule breakers should be punished, and that our own actions are wrong only because we're punished or because we might be punished, not because of anything intrinsically good or evil about those actions or those rules. As adults, we should outgrow this mindset, although some of us don't. Those who don't simply find surrogate authorities, other than their primary caregivers, to continue with this pattern of thinking. Perhaps they become rigid law and order moralists or strict adherents of the moral teachings of their religion. Like all of us then, I began as a deontologist, as a rule-based ethical thinker at least, wishing to obey the instructions of my parents, which, despite their own very serious moral shortcomings, probably kept me safe, at least at times, right? I still follow the old rule of looking both ways before crossing the street. Now, these rules of thumb are called heuristics. They're shortcuts. They're a method of making good choices without having to give any advanced thought, without having to take the energy, right? You come to a street, you don't have to think about it, you stop, you look both ways, you get across safely. And I continued as a deontologist throughout my youth, having come to believe that right and wrong are best determined by following the tenets and teachings of my conservative Christian faith. Although my failure to sometimes do so was accompanied by guilt and fear of damnation. But after studying ethics for the first time formally for the first time while in college, I very quickly became a teleologist, meaning that I was far more concerned about the outcomes of my moral decisions than by their means. As my philosophy professor, Dr. Wallace Roark, used to ask, if the ends don't justify the means, what does? Outcome-based ethics gave me a lot more freedom, a lot more agency, a lot more personal responsibility for making my moral choices. It wasn't up to what somebody else told me. It was now up to me. And doing so was harder, yet more meaningful for this reason than simply obeying the rules I'd been taught. And also it better assured me that my road to hell would not be paved with good intentions, right? That I was less likely to engage in harmful or destructive behavior that I could simply blame on having followed the rules or doing what I was told, obeying orders. I remained a teleologist only until recent years when I became more of a value-based ethicist. The problem with end-based ethics is that the only person really accountable is oneself. Right? It is ultimately up to the individual to determine what the best outcome should be. Based on what? The greatest good for the greatest number of people? That's one answer. This isn't a bad outcome, but what if the greatest number of people is only 51%? What happens to the other 49%? Is it really ethical for one person to take actions that work against 49% of the population? These days, Republicans often say Americans have spoken, and Trump is doing what they have asked him to do. Yet almost half of all voters voted against Trump. Are we now to conclude that such rhetoric means that we are no longer to be considered Americans? By the same logic, shouldn't most nations really mostly be working in the interest of India and China, since they have the largest populations? And what of ethical egoism? The belief that the right thing to do for everyone is to always act in one's own interest to begin with. This was the belief promoted, of course, by philosopher Ayn Rand, who believed we should always act in our own self-interest while respecting the rights of others to do the same. It's akin to the idea of laissez-faire, the economic and political doctrine advocating for minimal government intervention in the affairs of individuals and businesses so that the invisible hand of capitalism will magically work to the benefit of everyone's interest. So these questions led me to the greater question of who should decide. Who should decide what the outcome should be? If it's entirely up to every individual to answer it for themselves, then as these examples show, we might end up concluding that we should act in our own self-interest after all. Only unlike rule-based ethics, there is no longer the threat of punishment for doing so, because the rules have been thrown out, even if acting in our own interest ends up diminishing the lives of others. Some might argue that value-based ethics is but a type of teleology, and it has indeed been categorized as such since the time of Aristotle, who called it eudaimonism, from the Greek word meaning good spirit, right, emphasizing ethical behaviors that lead to human happiness in general. But I consider it a hybrid because rather than being based on a large set of rules to follow, or one overarching categorical imperative, it can be based on several broad values and guiding principles. The first person to have advocated for value ethics was Zeno of Citium, Cyprus, 300 years ago, the founder of Stoicism. Zeno considered values, which he called virtues, to be the greatest good because he believed they are the only thing that are useful in every situation. He said that all else is indifferent. meaning nothing else matters, including our own self-interest. So it could be that following our values results in our benefit or causes us to suffer. Pursuing our values could make us millionaires, or it could impoverish us. That's not the point. It never is. Because our values are broad, they will likely result in the greater good. But that, again, is not the point. The point is, what are our virtues? How do we uphold them, or our values? Zeno's virtues were wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, which if you go back and study the history of the time, you will understand why these were primal values that could really benefit society. The 7 principles that Unitarian Universalism sadly recently abandoned, beginning with the inherent worth and dignity of every person, are a more recent and I think better list of values or virtues that we should all adhere to in any circumstance, regardless of the consequences to our own lives. I also believe value ethics represent the highest stage of moral development as outlined by developmental psychologists. The founder in this field, Lawrence Kohlberg, said that this stage, which he called the post-conventional morality or the post-conventional stage, is based not on the authoritarian punitive model of early childhood, the pre-conventional stage, nor on the social laws and expectations of our community, the conventional stage, but upon universal ethical principles that apply to all people in all situations. Such validation is another reason I feel confident that value ethics is the best way to go. It reflects a more fully developed moral psychology. These days, I define my values as freedom, reason, and tolerance, and most importantly, human dignity. Right? My main ethical drive is toward human dignity and fulfillment, which I believe can only be achieved by creating social circumstances in which individuals are free to think and speak and choose our own purposes with equal access to the protections and benefits of society. Societies in which we are free to reason for ourselves without being told what we must or must not believe by our governments or our societies. Right? That's the liberal commitment to reason, is not just thinking well, which we should think well, but more importantly, that I trust that you can think for yourself. And therefore, I'm not going to get angry at you if you think differently than I do. I'm certainly not going to persecute you if you think differently than I do. Please don't persecute me if I think differently than you do. It does not feel good. So another name for my particular value ethic, which you often hear me talk about, is the humanistic ethic. The belief, as Erich Fromm put it, that the sole criterion of ethical value must be human welfare, and that the unfolding and growth of every person should be the aim of all social and political activities. And I love this because it's the only version of this commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person that gets at the full pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Right? The bottom half is more about general human welfare. We all need certain things in common, right? We need adequate shelter, we need adequate food, we need adequate health care, right? However that's achieved in a society. The upper half is more about self-actualization, where we need to unfold as individuals, become happy, be content basically by finding purpose and meaning in our lives. Right? And we can't do that if the bottom half isn't fulfilled. Usually, some people can, but the problem is we have societies that concentrate on one or the other rather than both. right? You've got communism and socialism that tend to say, oh, the government's going to provide all of this, but often do at the expense of one's freedom. So you can't unfold in a situation like that. You can't fully be yourself. At the same time, if you're completely focusing on freedom, removing restrictions that regulate anything, we tend not to focus on those basic needs that everybody needs. That's your responsibility, not the government's. Why should we provide those needs for you? We'll tax you, but we don't want to tax and spend. My goodness, we'll just tax you. Anyway. The sole criterion of ethical value must be human welfare and the unfolding and growth of every person. It should be the aim of all social and political activities. That encapsulates my ethic these days, my value-based ethics. And whether you agree with where I've ended up or not, the important point that I want you to grasp is that my struggle to understand ethics and to know what the best thing to do is has changed. It has changed over time, and I suspect that it will continue to evolve as it has throughout my entire life up to this point. Making the right choices is never simple, no matter where we are on our ethical journey. At least they shouldn't be easy, right? If ethical decisions are easy, it's a good sign that there is something wrong with your ethics. Because there is almost always negative consequences resulting in our moral choices. For this reason, every ethical decision is accompanied by a moral dilemma, or we're not paying attention. That's why it's so hard. That's why it's vital, essential to life, that we develop the kind of character that we can trust will help us make the best decisions that we can in every situation, rather than merely deciding as we go. In his book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Donald Robertson tells us the Stoics believed only foolish people vacillate, driven by contradictory passions which flutter from one thing to another like butterflies. You ever watch a butterfly? Right? That's the description of ethics. People don't have any. What am I feeling? What am I feeling in the moment? Rather than developing a moral character, they rely on what philosopher Bertrand Russell called emotivism. Ethical judgments that are merely disguised expressions of one's feelings about an issue that flap about inconsistently. Such unpredictability and inconsistency, as I discussed earlier, can lead to some of the most unforgivable cruelties imaginable. Right? When our morals are based on emotional thinking and moralizing, our feelings and our own self-interest, it can lead to some of the worst cruelties imaginable. That's why I'm talking about this today. That's why I care so much about this. That's why I continue to study and wrestle with ethics and why it comes up in my sermons so often. Because tragically, unbelievably, our society doesn't teach us ethics, but prefers that we merely absorb and accept the cultural ethos through social osmosis without ever questioning what we have been molded to believe is right and wrong. This means that it is up to us as individuals to take responsibility to develop the kind of character that we can trust will guide us toward doing what is best no matter what we feel, no matter what our own interests are, but to do what is best as people of integrity, as people who have character, people who have ethics. But remember that it is a lifelong journey, for we are, or at least we should be, always in the act of becoming good. Thank you.